Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's chat. My name is Vanessa, and I'm part of the Understood team. Today, we'll be talking about understanding developmental coordination disorder. And joining us today is our expert, Priscila Caçola, who will be answering your questions. Priscilla is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and the director of the Developmental Motor Cognition Lab at the University of Texas in Arlington. Hi, Priscilla. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi there. Thanks for having me here. Sorry, my son decided to join us today just now. Yeah, I'm so excited. I'm a researcher in motor development, and I have a very specific interest in developmental coordination disorders. So besides teaching, I'm also very interested in understanding what DCD is and how it can help the families that have children, individuals that have the disorder.
Thank you so much for that summary. That is super helpful for our viewers right now watching. And before we jump into our questions, I wanted to let everyone know that if you have a question for Priscilla, to type it into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. If you don't have a question, feel free to introduce yourself and say hello. We're happy to have you today. So we're going to start off with a question that I think will also help us frame today's chat. What is developmental coordination disorder?
Right. So it's really important to understand what the condition is. We talk a lot about DCD, right? So that's the short form for developmental coordination disorder. And what that is, it's a chronic condition that will affect performance and learning of motor skills. So individuals with DCD are commonly known as people that are clumsy, awkward, uncoordinated because they have trouble performing motor skills. We see a lot of difficulties in balance and fine motor skills, and most importantly, we see these difficulties affecting daily living activities. So, for example, I have trouble with dressing and maybe zipping up a jacket. And also academic or work performance, right? So we see kids with DCD having trouble doing schoolwork and keeping up with their peers when they're doing homework or even during the lessons.
That's really great, and I appreciate you saying that it's referred to as DCD. For our audience out there, we will refer to it as DCD in our questions, just so that everyone knows. The next question that we have is, what are some of the signs of DCD at different ages? You mentioned some of the struggles that you may have. Is it different at different ages for a child?
Yes, it is. It is different because we see the demands get much higher as children age, right? So very early on in preschool children, we'll see kids having trouble holding and managing utensils. So they'll typically prefer to eat with their fingers. They'll have trouble navigating stairs. We see maybe a little bit of refusal. We start to see refusal and difficulties holding a crayon and coloring, and difficulties trying to paddle a bike, even if it has wheels on. So this is what we start seeing. Later on, we see a lot of difficulties cutting, so using scissors, definitely handwriting, that's a very common one. And that's the interesting thing. We start seeing refusal, avoidance of some activities because they are very aware that they can't do it very well. We see problems in balance. So we see kids that bump into objects a lot, have trouble navigating the environment around them, have trouble sitting upright and sitting still for long periods of time. And each child is very different, but we see in general, we see some of those difficulties. There's a great resource on the website, and it's actually called Signs of DCD at Different Ages. It's a great checklist for parents and teachers also to look and see what are the main things that you see in a child.
Thank you for mentioning that. We will drop in those links into the chat box so that folks can check that out.
Sure.
Does DCD overlap with learning and thinking differences, like ADHD or dysgraphia?
Um, yes. So in neurodevelopmental disorders, co-occurrence of conditions is usually the rule and not the exception. Um, so research has shown that about 50% of children with ADHD also have DCD. Now, keep in mind that this is mostly undiagnosed. Um, and So that's important to dissociate what are problems that are due to an attention deficit and problems that are really due to a motor skill disorder, because kids will need very specific adaptations and accommodations for those. Um, and it's interesting that you refer to dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is actually one very specific component of DCD. So DCD is a global motor disorder, right? So we see problems in fine motor skills and gross motor skills, balance, coordination, aiming and catching abilities, and things like that. Dysgraphia is very specific to handwriting. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the kids that have a dysgraphia diagnosis probably also have DCD. It's just that the the problem is so distinct, is so visible in handwriting, and that's what affects academic achievement, that we tend to focus on that. But a lot of times, if we go and evaluate their balance, their ball skills, we'll see that they have trouble in there too.
You mentioned diagnose, and so I want to ask, if a parent is concerned that their child may have DCD, how can they get it diagnosed? Is it through the school or other?
That's a great question. I believe it's important to seek for a diagnosis, right? So kids can get the proper intervention and accommodations, especially in the school environment. Um, DCD is a disorder of exclusion, and it's typically secondary as well. So, in the cases that we talked about, when a child has ADHD, typically the ADHD diagnosis will come first. The important thing to do is to actually observe some of the signs that we talked about. Talk to a pediatrician, talk to the school. I would also recommend that a parent seeks for intervention before the diagnosis is made. So there's a lot of things that we can do to help a child actually accomplish some of these skills, regardless of the diagnosis. But the best way to go is to look for a developmental pediatrician. And if that's not possible, to talk to a general pediatrician, and they can guide some of this diagnostic process. It's an interdisciplinary team, right? Because it's not that easy. We need to look at the history of the child, some of these difficulties, assess motor skills, and look at how that is affecting really the life of the child. And then on top of all that, we really need to exclude some other conditions that may be the cause of the motor problems.
I love that you mentioned that. So I appreciate you saying that it's kind of a working together as a team. That's super important for parents. We're starting to get some questions, and our first question here is from Lori. Hi, Lori. Thanks for joining us. She says, hello. What are some proven therapies that help children with DCD?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I like to talk about that because children with ACD usually need immediate help, right? Because we want to make sure that we can adapt and change the environment for their success. And the proven therapies are usually known as task oriented. So, if the child has trouble with handwriting, the most common one, the task oriented therapy will be about focusing on what we can do to make handwriting easier for that child. And those things can be doing less handwriting, changing the utensil, the pencil, the pen, changing the paper, changing the sitting, and the desk of the child. And those things can really help with that success on that task. So we talk about functional skills, right? So it's really looking at functional skills, skills that are needed, and looking at the task. First of all, that's very important. It's proven that we need to modify the task and not trying to change the child initially. Um, that's important when it comes especially to classrooms, right, and school environments. Modifying tasks is proven to be very beneficial for these children.
Thank you so much. That's super great. The next question comes from Robin. My daughter with DCD can pedal a bike after having OT for 3 years, but she gives up easily still. Any tips for getting her to continue and build on the muscle and motor memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, one very specific thing that we see in children with DCD is that they are very aware of their difficulties. That their level of awareness of their issues and how that makes them different sometimes than other kids is so high. Um, and they can talk about that if you ask them. And so we see a lot of avoidance and frustration, and then we see lack of persistence, right? Because it's, well, I've tried and I can't do it, so why am I continuing? Why am I going to continue to do this? I think the first thing to do is really praise effort, right? And break down tasks into very, very small steps that they can accomplish. So the sense of accomplishment is really important. So maybe sometimes the accomplishment is not performing the task, is to doing the same task just 1 second faster. And maybe just holding the pencil just a little bit longer. So this is really important. So the breaking down of the steps can be really beneficial. Now, obviously, putting some external rewards can be helpful as well. And maybe it's also time to ask the child, what is it that they want to do? What is it that's going to make them feel successful, right? Especially after so much time in OT and therapy, you would be amazed at the things that they can come up and the things that they know it can help them.
I love that. I love that you mentioned breaking up the task. I think that's super important. As a parent myself, I do find that if we chunk it up, it makes it a little less overwhelming. So that's a really great tip. Thank you. We have another question here from JS, and it's similar to another question being asked from someone who's also watching, is how do you untangle dyspraxia, dyslexia, and dysgraphia? So the difference of them and DCD.
Right. So that's a really broad question, big question. So I'm going to try my best.
Thank
I'm an
you.
expert in DCD, and a lot of times DCD is known as dyspraxia. I tend to focus on the term DCD because that is the term used on the DSM, right? So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So I tend to refer to a more proper a medical term because it's easier for me to convince people, especially schools when they're being difficult, that it's a real disorder, right? And the children should have accommodations and adaptations for that disorder. But you see a lot in the community the term dyspraxia being used. And I think what they are referring to is really just a motor skill disorder. The problem with DCD or dyspraxia is that motor skills are the baseline of and the foundation of everything we do. And some of these difficulties will come up, will be visible as something else. Like I said, avoidance and frustration. If we look at a child and see avoidance and frustration, we'll talk about behavioral problems. We sometimes will have a hard time seeing that there is a motor skill problem underlying the avoidance and frustration. So it comes up as something really general, but it's actually the root of it is the motor skill problem. Dyslexia is obviously a little bit different, so I'm not going to get into it because that's not my expertise, but that's, obviously reading, spelling. And those are actually associated, like I said, comorbidity or co-occurrence is the rule and not the exception. So we can find kids that have dyslexia and also DCD. And I talked a little bit about dysgraphia, right? It's a very specific component of DCD that is really about handwriting. And I've seen, like I said, I've seen a lot of kids that have a dysgraphia diagnosis, but they actually have DCD. It's just that maybe the most important difficulties in handwriting, or that's the thing that we look at, right? Um, so I hope that clarified a little bit. I'm happy to talk more about it.
I think that was great, and I appreciate you mentioning your expertise. I will say that we have additional great resources on all other learning and thinking differently. Dyslexia is definitely one of them, and you can check out our section, which has some great articles, tools, and tips that might be helpful in getting to know a little bit more. We have another question here. We mentioned motor skills, and this is a really great question. How do we get a child to learn if they're having difficulty eating? So, manipulating, parent says here, in their case, spaghetti, and learning to use a knife. Any products or ways that they could master that skill in a way?
Right. So it's important to remember that eating is a motor skill. So it requires a lot of practice, right? So the child will learn through repetition. And it's actually harder for us as when we are assessing a child to even look at a child and see and say that they are having difficulties with that because it's very dependent on how much time parents spend on that, right? And what is it that they offer to the child as an opportunity to practice skills. I'm the type of mom, for example, that does not mind a 3, 4 year old eating with their fingers because, it's about accomplishing the task. So, how do we get that? So, usually by modeling, that can be very important. So, the child watching that and watching different strategies can be very important. Maybe talking through strategies can be really good. Having utensils that are appropriate to the size of the child's hands, right? That's very, very important as well. But I think modeling, practicing, maybe trying different things with the child, trying different grips, trying different games. So things like if we can, cut this meatball in half, we can eat 2 of them. So things that can, especially small children, preschool age, they're very motivated by this little accomplishment, and I think that can be helpful. But remember, it's all about practice and repetition. It takes a lot of time to learn motor skills. We tend to forget, for example, how long it took for a child to learn how to walk. It was a whole lot of falling and standing, pulling up on the coffee table and standing and trying. So one day they could actually walk. That was a whole lot of repetition. And we tend to forget that the other skills are just like that. So we need to give opportunities to the child to repeat that, repeat in their own ways with their own sort of motivators and model that task if it's important to the family.
I appreciate you saying or comparing it to walking. It does take a long time, and sometimes as our children grow, we forget how long it took. And so, repetition and patience is a really good reminder and key there. Thank you. We have another question here from South Shore Mom. 2 questions. So, I'll start off with the first one. Do you find that kids with DCD get tired more easily? And the second question there is for teens and tween boys with DCD, what sports or activities do you find help keep them active and that aren't as challenging?
Okay, those are great questions. About being tired first, yes, absolutely. So let's think about 3 different components of DCD. So children with DCD are typically less accurate in their motor skills. They take a little bit longer, right? So speed is a little bit different to perform a skill, and it takes them more effort to perform the same skill as a typical developing child. So, and I like to talk about effort because it is not visible, right? So we see the lower accuracy, we can count time and see that it takes longer. But when I see children with DCD in my lab, for example, and in my clinic, they just take it's almost like they have to constrain every muscle of their body so they can handwrite one word, and that's visible if we're paying attention. But if we're not, we tend to not observe that. So obviously that leads to more fatigue, and they definitely need more breaks. So that's very important to recognize. So to the praising of the effort and the fact that they need more breaks so they can gather energy for the next task.
I love that.
And yeah, this is very important, especially for when kids are in school, to remind teachers of that. When it comes to activities for I don't think in this case it would make a difference whether it's twin boys or girls with DCD. I do think it's important to actually provide a lot of opportunities for play skills. And I love that they're not too challenging, but challenging enough, right, that they would be motivating. I find that kids with DCD have a lot of success with individual sports and activities. So things like swimming, right? That it's themselves in the water, so it's a little bit easier with yoga. maybe martial arts. I've seen that too. So it helps with their balance and it's themselves only. So as opposed to dealing with passing a ball to another child that is also moving. So that may be a little bit more complicated. I've seen a lot of success too with arts and music activities. So that has a lot of, when there's a lot of external feedback, right? So they can help kids improve their motor skills that are associated with artistic activities. So you can try different things and see what they like, but I've seen a lot of kids do really well with those.
Those are some really great tips and gives a good variety of what a child may like.
Hmm.
I particularly like that you mentioned art. So that's always a good reminder that might be a good way to go. One of our viewers, Robin, who we already answered their question, really appreciates the response and found it helpful. So I just want to acknowledge them and thank you, Robin, for letting us know. We
Sure,
have
thank
another
you.
question here from Rami. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name. Is it common for kids with DCD to be a little immature for their age? And how does coordination affect maturity?
So I'm trying to think whether that's mental maturity. Um, I I think kids with DCD tend to be more silly, if that makes sense, because remember they are aware of their difficulties. So sometimes instead of the way that they find, which they're so creative, so smart, the way that they find to go around an activity and not being asked to do it again, right? Because they know they might fail is to be silly. So I tell, for example, my college students when they work with children with DCD, they are usually outsmarted because children will come up with a whole set of story and go around the situations and make fun of the situations so they don't need to practice anymore because remember they don't want to fail. That's it's all about that. They're aware of that and they don't want to get frustrated. They don't want to disappoint. So they may be a little bit sillier. Yes, I have seen that. So I'm not sure if that's exactly the maturity issue. But think about, I'm always amazed at the compensation strategies that children come up with, right? And how smart they are to, you know, to try and take attention away from their difficulties and bring attention to something positive about them. And I think I would look at it as a very positive thing that they can do that. And that's something that depending on the age of the child that parents can talk about it, right? So it's great that you can do this. You have such an amazing ability of talking about situations or coming up with stories or being silly and but sometimes we need to do that. That's not your strength, but that's what we're going to try and develop at this time. So I hope that's the sense that the parent was talking about.
I think that was really great. Please feel free to clarify anything that may have not been exactly what you were thinking about to the viewer. But I do love the positive reinforcement and speaking with your child, depending on their age, of course, about a good time to do something and possibly doing something a little differently. As we think of parents and motor skills, what are some things that parents can do at home to help their kids with motor skills?
Okay, so I think the first thing that parents can do is to promote a lot of opportunities to develop motor skills, right? To really enjoy activities that involve motor skill performance and to promote that because I think one way to actually get them more excited is whether the family is also involved in activities. But this has to go hand in hand with praising effort, right? We need to understand that children with DCD will have trouble accomplishing tasks, especially if they're not motivated for them. So, praising effort and focusing on effort to do better is very important. They need to feel like their effort is acknowledged, right? So that's very important. Now, making sure that strategies are put in place so kids can do a little bit better. So, for example, if they bump into furniture a lot and furniture that can maybe hurt them a little bit, it's about saying, remember when we are 2 steps away from the coffee table, we want to stop, wait a little bit, and then continue walking around it. Or at the table, this is what we do. So we have utensils, we use it once, we put it down, and then we get the napkin. So it's really helping children come up with those steps and strategies that are important for the parents, right? So it's whatever is important for them is coming up with strategies, maybe visual supports, maybe cues, right? So it's coffee table, stop and wait, then go around it. Uh, that can really help them focus on the things that remind them of things that are important for them to do.
I love the reminders and taking it step by step. Again, really good, keeping in mind that it takes time, and taking it step by step and chunking it can really help your child, of course, depending on their age as well. We have time for one more question, I believe. Actually, two, sorry. So I'll start off with Dawn. I have an 11-year-old who I also suspected of having DCD. Is it too late to get a diagnosis from a pediatrician?
No, I don't think so. No. So I would highly recommend that you pursue the testing for that. Right? It's not the diagnosis because we don't know if it's there, but the testing for that. Because even if your child does not have DCD, it's possible that your child, a teenager now, will have motor problems. And even if that's not DCD, your kid may need a little bit of help with that. So, absolutely, it's important to remember that the demands on motor performance get really high as children age. We don't see that, but we are required to, in college environments now, to type and to type really fast and to move fast. And that's how sometimes we also measure knowledge. So I would definitely pursue testing for that because accommodations can be put in place for your son.
I appreciate you mentioning the fast-paced world and the typing, because as we get older, there are things
Mhm.
that I think if we sit down and think about it, there are a fair amount of things that our motor skills are required for. So thank you for that
Yes,
answer.
also I did mention that, but I think it's important to. We're a little bit away from that, but there is driving. Driving is a very complex motor skill, and it's something that if we know that there is an issue, we want to come up with very specific strategies, right, for that to happen.
Absolutely, that's another great one, driving. Our last question is low muscle tone part of DCD or a separate condition? My child has been diagnosed with both.
Okay. Yeah, so low muscle tone is not part of the diagnostic criteria of DCD. So I do love that you have a DCD diagnosis plus the low muscle tone because the more specific we are about these difficulties, even though they're associated a lot of times, the more people can understand what is it that we need to do to improve low muscle tone and adapt for that and also for DCD difficulties. So having the both things separately is probably the best way to go. So
Great. Thank you so much, Priscilla. We've run out of time. This chat has been wonderful. You've given some great tips and reminders that I'm sure our viewers here have taken away. And I want to remind everyone that this chat will be archived at u.org/calendar. Please allow up to 24 hours to access that archive. And if you want to continue this conversation, you could do so at u.org/community. Priscilla, thank you so much for being with us today and all the wonderful information that you've given us.
yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you to all those watching or being tuned to the chat. I love the questions; they're really great.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your questions, everyone, and have a wonderful day.